Hello everyone, this is another episode here of the Toon Boom Tip of the Week, and this week I want to show you about how to rig an eyeball. And there's a variety of different ways of doing eyeballs in Toon Boom software, but I'm showing you kind of a neat rig today that is going to make use of a mask or a cutter module to cut off the iris with the white of the eye. And I'm going to start out today in the first video here by showing it to you in Animate Pro and Harmony. And even if you're an Animate customer, I recommend watching this one first because it's a little bit more visual to see what's going on in the network view. And then it's going to help you with your understanding of what's going on when we show you how to do it in Animate. So I'll just show you first here what I prepared in terms of artwork. I have several different drawing layers here, and let's take a look at them in my drawing view so that I can isolate those drawing layers. So I've got my first drawing here is my eyelid drawing, and my eyelid drawing consists of the outline, which is the black of the eye there around the outside, and it also consists of, just for fun, I did a stylistic little sort of pink part of the eye there. And then I've also got the white of the eye. And in this case, I made the white not 100% white because you always kind of want to have your, and same thing with blacks, you always kind of want to have your blacks so that they're not all the way down to zero, just because it looks better when the blacks aren't completely black and the whites aren't completely white. And then the next drawing I have here is my iris. So it's pretty much just a circle, and I've put a gradient on there for fun, and I've added some little, ticks there on that one. And then in my case here, I did a separate drawing for the pupil and for the highlight, which you won't be able to see because it's white on white, but you don't need to have a separate drawing for the pupil or the highlight, but sometimes, most of the time you'd do them all as one drawing. But I just thought for fun, in this case, that I would do them as separate drawings to show you that if you had a shot where you needed to have the size of your pupil expand, then you can create your pupil as a circle there, and if you stick your pivot point with your pivot tool, actually I'll show you how to do this properly. So let's go in our drawing view, and then if you select that circle drawing with your select tool, when you select your pivot tool, then you see how it makes this box with the circle in the center. It's kind of smartly trying to tell you where the center of that is, and this only happens when you make that selection. So now that you've made that selection and it shows you this bounding box, you can really put the pivot point sort of smack dab in the middle there. And then when we go back to our camera view and we animate this, you can see how, since the pivot point is in the center, when you hold down Shift and use your transform tool, you could make the pupil get larger or get smaller. So if you have a tight close-up shot where you need to have some really cool rig on the eyes for some reason, then this is a good alternative. If you're not going to be animating the pupil, then don't make it a separate layer because it's just going to give yourself more headache later on. But it is really cool if you're having a close-up shot, and sometimes you might want to have maybe like your standard sort of swapped pupil in for your cutout character, and then you'll have a separate rig of the head for a close-up shot that has some of this more detailed rigging in it. It's up to you really. So now that we've talked about the pupil, let's talk a little bit about how to animate this thing. Because right now these are all separate elements, and first of all I want to make sure that I have a peg layer that I can use to make these three elements in the center move together. So I'll just add a peg layer on my pupil there, and since we're working in Animate Pro or Harmony, we can use our network view to organize things. And by the way, I'll just turn on my network view toolbar here so that I can select the last node in the network down here, and then I'll do an order network up, which is going to order the network up from the bottom to the top. And then now I can see this here. And for those of you who are using Animate and who aren't familiar with the network view, I'll just explain briefly that each one of these layers in your timeline is represented by a module in your network. So I can connect my pupil to my iris, I can connect it to the highlight, And now when I select that peg, I can animate all three of those elements together. But now you'll notice when you're animating that, you'll see that you're animating your pupil off the edge of your eye, and you see the iris off the edge of the eye, and that's not terribly useful because we would prefer if this can cut off automatically when it reaches the edge of the white. That's going to serve us better in the animation phase because we won't have to go back and make any adjustments on those eyes. Okay, so if we want to do that now, this is where we're going to start using some effects to achieve this. And this is when it becomes really useful to have this built-in compositing in your animation program because it allows you to use effects on your character rigs to achieve certain looks. So let's say in this case, if we want to to cut off the iris with the edge of the eye, first we need to isolate the white of the eye because on my drawing layer I have, for my eyelid, I have the white of the eye and I have the black and I have the little pink bits there. So first I need to isolate the white of the layer. And when I'm doing that now, I will just go into my module library, which is where I can find my effects. And I can add my color override effect in here, which is going to then give me the ability to isolate that drawing. So if I just hold down the Alt key while I'm dragging this, it's going to snap that in there, and now I have the color override module connected to this. So the reason I wanted to show the Animate Pro and Harmony Way first is because you can see when you're looking at this in your network view, it's very visual about what's happening. You can see the connections. You can see that now I'm taking my eyelid and I'm plugging my eyelid into my color override. When you do this in Animate and you're working in a layer-based system, you can still do it, but it's just that it's a little bit more difficult to see visually what's going on, and I'll show you that one after. But now if I go back into my camera view, what I want to do with this color override module is I want to isolate the white of the eye. So I'll just click on my yellow options box here and I'll drag back over my layer properties window, which opened on my other screen. And now I can see inside there I have only one palette, so if you have more than one palette, select the palette that has the eye color in it. And then it would have been better for me if I labeled these correctly, and this is where it comes into play very importantly about making sure that you're using a naming convention when you're doing your labels. So let me just do this one again, and I'll just rename these really quick, hopefully spelling them correctly. And when you hit enter, it goes directly to the next one, so it makes it really easy to label them all in a row. And I'm just prefixing everything with I so that I know that these all sort of belong together. That way you don't have to have too many separate elements there. Okay, so now that I've labeled these, I'll go back into my network view and I'll click on my options box for my color override module again. And now we'll see how it's much easier for me to pick the color that I want. Picture that sometimes you even have more than one color here that looks the same. Like you might have a black that you've done for the eye, but you'll have another black that you've done for the hair and another black that you've done for whatever. And so if they're all the same color black, you won't be able to see just by looking at them which one is the important one. So that's why it's key here to make sure that you name those elements correctly. So now I can drag and drop the eye white because what I want to do is I want to isolate just this color. And so then I can drag it over here, and I need to make sure that I check the checkbox for render selected colors. And you see what that does is it just renders now only the white of the eye. And so this becomes incredibly useful when you want to make sure that you just want to work with that particular color. And I'm going to fix it later so that we see the original eye underneath it again, but I'm just going to leave it like this for now so that I can show you now when we're going to go ahead and apply this to a cutter, how that will work. So the next thing we want to do is we want to cut the iris and the pupil and the highlight with the white of the eye here. So whenever you're using a module that has more than one input port here, the majority of the time the left-hand port is going to be your mask and the right-hand port is going to be your original drawing. So let's just say, for example, that I want to, now hold down Alt again, I can slide this in with my iris. Now I've got the original drawing in the right-hand side, and then I'll take my color override white of the eye and plug it into the left. And you see right away what it does is it cuts that iris with the white of the eye. But I want to go a step further. I'll click on the yellow options box of my cutter module, and then I can click on inverted. And then what inverted does means it's going to keep that here only when it's inside the white of the eye. But as you can see, I applied the cutter only to the iris. And there's a couple of different ways that you could do this when you want to address multiple elements. You can copy and paste your cutter so it's a clone. You can bring in 3 different cutters. But the easiest way of doing this here is just to instead to gather together all 3 of these elements so that you can apply them to your cutter at once. So if I drag in my composite module, I can use this composite module to gather together the iris, the pupil, and the highlight all into one here. And then I also want to keep them as vector drawings. So I'll click on my left options box there, and you'll see that by default these composite modules are set to as bitmap, and I'll just set this to pass through, which means that all it's doing is gathering together those 3 elements. It's not flattening them into one bitmap. And now that they've been gathered together, I can plug these into my cutter module. And now you see that as a whole, I'm able to select that peg layer and animate the pupil around. But the last thing I need to do here is I need to make sure that I can see, the original drawing underneath everything, because right now I've lost, the eyelid lines that I had. So let's just go ahead and take away this one that's going into the bottom there. And I'm going to replace that one by the original eyelid. So if I just drag and drop the original eyelid down to the composite module, you'll see how now it's going to take a copy of that eyelid layer and drag it down. And then another copy of the eyelid layer is going into that color override in order to isolate the white of the eye to act as the mask for the cutter. So you see, it's really pretty easy to see what's going on when we're looking at this in the network view. As long as you don't get intimidated, there's a lot of useful information here about how things are working. And then I'll just give you one other tip here in terms of when you're animating this around. You want to make sure that when the pupil is in the center of the eye, that it is pretty circular and round. If you're going to animate the position over to the side here, you might sort of notice that it looks a little bit weird, but you might not realize why it looks a little bit weird. And the reason that it looks a little bit weird is because, truthfully, what the eye does is it also sort of scrunches in when it gets to the side. That's an illusion of perspective. But when you grab on that pupil peg, then you see that my pivot point on my peg is like way far away. So I can do one of 2 things. I can either promote the pivot from my pupil layer up to the pupil peg, and if I want to do that, then I can use this drawing apply embedded pivot on parent peg, just like I showed you guys last week. But I don't really need to do that. I can do that and it works fine, but if I want to go back and edit my pupil, you see how it's moving both of them together. So let's do, instead of doing that, I'll just back up a few steps and make sure, or I can go back here and make sure it's just applied on the drawing layer. Okay, so now instead of doing that, what I would do in this case, because I want to be able to animate that and I also want to be able to animate my pupil separately, is I can just use my rotate tool and I can drag my, rotate tool, make sure I select my peg layer. I can drag my rotate tool into the center of that eye. And now when I want to animate that eye as a whole, it's going to be easy for me to scrunch it in. So let's do a couple of keyframes on this just to show you what this looks like. And so what I'll do is I'll take everything and I'll just add an extra peg layer that's going to be the parent of everything, and I hit Control P or Command P to add an extra peg layer in here. And then I'll make that a parent of the pupil and a parent of the original eyelid. And that way I can just collapse everything inside my peg over here. And then I can hit Extend Exposure, F5. And oops, there's something else you'll notice there is that I also have a couple of different swap drawings on my eyelid layer. So let's take a look at our eyelid layer one more time. Inside my eyelid layer, I've got that original eyelid, and I've got one that's a bit smaller, and then I've got one that's closed. And because of the fact that we use this effect in here that isolates that white of the eye, it automatically also cuts it off for these other drawings. So let's just actually drag this one over there and drag this one over here so that we have a few drawings where we can see each one. So when my eye is open, it shows the whole, thing, and then when it gets smaller, it's still automatically cutting it off with the white of this drawing layer, so it still works. And even when I close the eye, it still works. So it's really, really cool. And then let's do one last thing, and let's animate the position of this over time. So let's start with it in the corner there, that's fine, and then I'll move it, or actually maybe I'll start with it in the center, so we'll start with it over here. So we want it pretty round. Remember, when it's dead center, it's got to be pretty round. And then we want to move it over to the side. And as we move it over to the side, we'll make it scrunched a bit more because that's that optical illusion that you see there. And then now if we look at this animating, see how cool that looks? And because these drawings are pretty similar, the one eyelid to the other eyelid drawing, I could probably even morph those two eyelids together and get a good looking result to have, if I wanted to have a really slow move over. But usually we'd swap from one drawing to the other pretty quickly. So I could also just select this one and move it over, let's say, a couple of frames. Hi everyone, so I just showed you how to rig an eyeball in Animate Pro and Harmony, and now I'm going to show you the same concept of how to do it in Animate. So when you're working with Animate, it's a layer-based compositing system. So you've got your layers over here, and you have to add all of your effects and work with your effects in the layers. And so it's possible to do some types of rigs over here, of course, but it's a little bit more limited in terms of what it can do in effects. In this case, I can achieve the same effect in Animate as I can with Animate Pro. But in some cases, you just simply can't because the layers don't show enough information to be able to make those types of complex connections that we would make in Animate Pro. So let's just start off here. First thing that I want to do is I want to gather together the highlight, the pupil, and the iris layer so that I can animate all three of these together. And so I will add a peg layer to my pupil, and then I'll just drag and drop my highlight and my iris layers in there so that I can animate these three together. And you'll notice, by the way, on the pupil layer that I've put the pivot point in the center just like I did in Animate Pro so that I can dilate that pupil or contract it as needed for different scenes or for one scene. And as I mentioned also, it is not necessary for the vast majority of shots to do an eye this complex because you wouldn't see that kind of dilation on an iris or on a pupil unless you're very close. So it's a very cool type of rig to do if you have to do a close-up shot. If you're doing a bit of a further away shot, then I'd recommend that you put the pupil, the iris, and the highlight all on one layer together. And then you can just animate those together because you wouldn't see that contraction in it. But this is a very cool way of doing it, and I wanted to show you the most sort of advanced technique here. Okay, so now that I've got these three together, then you'll notice if I try to animate this pupil or peg layer that contains all three of these, that my pivot point is in the wrong place. So I talked about pivot points in my tip of the week last week, but in this case, I'll just use my rotate layer to drag and drop the pivot point of my peg in the center because since I'm not going to be swapping views on this drawing, it's totally fine for me just to use a peg layer pivot. And then now that I've got that in the right place, I can animate all three of these elements around together, and then I can also animate these guys separately on their drawing layers. Of course, you wouldn't want to animate the position of your pupil, but you can always animate the dilation and contraction. Okay, so now the next thing I want to do is I want to isolate the white of the eye so that I can, use that as a mask for my iris and pupil. So if I want to isolate the white of the eye, the first thing I want to do here is I want to add my color override effect. And then with that color override effect, if I drag and drop my eyelid layer onto it, then I'll be able to access the layer properties of the color override, and it will show me the palette here that's being used by this eye. So this now shows a very important concept also, which is naming your palette property properly, which I mentioned also in the Animate Pro video. It's almost even more critical to name things properly when you're working in Animate because, as I'm sure you guys will know, the standard Animate palette that comes in there has many, many different colors in it. It comes with like 100 colors in it. So if you are trying to isolate one color in that list of 100, it's going to be very difficult for you to know which color you're trying to isolate unless you name things properly. And even if you're working in Animate, I would also recommend getting rid of colors that you're not using because I find that it's much easier if you're going to be doing compositing, if you're going to be doing effects, anything like that, it's much easier just to have the colors that you need. Having additional colors might seem great, but it really does slow things down actually if you're going to be doing a lot of inking and painting or a lot of effects. So now that we've got our palette set up, I'll go back to my color override module and I can take the eye white layer and I can drag and drop it into the same render selected colors only tab that I had inside of Animate Pro. And now that I've got that in there, then I can use this color override on the eyelid now as a mask with all of these other layers over here. So let's add our mask. And then when I add the mask layer, you'll see that there's two places. There's the mask that has the star next to it, and then there's a mask that has the box next to it. And you want to put the mask itself inside the one that has the box, and you want to put the original drawings inside the star. So I'll just collapse in here my pupil layer, and I'll put that inside the star. And then I'm going to take the color override with the eyelid layer and put that inside the mask. And just like when we're doing this in Animate Pro, it does the opposite of what we want. So we have to double click on the mask layer and then click on inverted. And now you'll see that it is cutting off that pupil automatically with the edge of the eye. But just like with Animate Pro, when you do this, you need a copy of the original one going back to the main timeline here so that you can access or so that you can see it when you're animating the eye. So this is the one thing that's a little bit tricky when you're working with Animate versus Animate Pro, that when you're working with Animate Pro, you can just take that connection and you can make two connections down in your composite and then you're just animating one eyeball. With Animate, you've got to do a clone on the selected layers. And when you clone the selected layer, you can drag the clone out. And this is all fine and good, but the only thing that you have to be aware of is that when you're animating a clone, then the drawings are tied together in the sense that if I make a change to one drawing, let's say I'm just going to take this eye and I'm going to add an X to it. So you'll see that if I make that change on one drawing, that change is also made on the other one. It's made on both clones. So that type of a change is cloned from one drawing to another. We'll just undo that. But you'll notice that the exposure here is separate. So it's kind of better if you want to animate blinks and whatnot to animate them all on one eyelid and then just copy and paste exposure from one to the other. That way the exposure will match. And that's really the best way of doing things in Animate. But let's just say, for example, I want to do the same thing that I did in my Animate Pro example. I'm going to extend the exposure on my eyelid, and then I also need to extend the exposure on my pupil. And so now that it's all extended, then I'll take my transform tool and I'll double check. It looks like the order here. Ah, yes. Oh, no. Pupil is on top. Oh, I see what I did. There's some kind of a keyframe here. Let's take that keyframe out. All right. So now that I've got these guys cutting off here automatically, I can take my my pupil group there and I can animate the position to the other side, and I can do the same thing where I'm going to make it skinnier on one side to get that optical illusion as the eyeball is animating, and then I just want to remove this extraneous keyframe that I've added there somehow. So now we see it animating from one side to the other. So that's how we would do this same type of eyeball in Animate as opposed to doing it in Animate Pro. So the only real limitation here when working with Animate is that you can't do that direct connection with your eyelid, so you have to do the clone. And then when you do your clone, you're going to have to copy and paste the exposure from one to the other. So that's it on the tip of the week this week on how to rig the eyeball. So stay tuned next week.